So the question is, right, if Jesus says, I am a good shepherd, if I was, outside the fact I'm even a preacher, if someone was asking me, why should I follow Jesus? I don't know that usually my word choice would be, I am, or that he is the good shepherd. Might use other sort of metaphors. I'm not sure exactly which one would work in this place. So the question is, why do you want a shepherd? Why do you want a shepherd? And maybe you're like, I don't. Period. Like, that's kind of it. So once again, I was reading about farming this week uh, and sheep, and learning about when they are prone to wander or prone to straying. And one place that I found that talks about raising sheep gave a couple reasons that'll be up on the screen. One is that there's a sense of danger approaching. So like wolves or dogs or something else that feels dangerous. They might stray if they sense something bad is going to happen, which makes sense. Another one might just be because they're curious. They do it to satisfy their curiosity, just kind of wander around because it seems interesting. Looks cool, I'm gonna go check it out. Another one might be just that they're not paying attention while grazing. They didn't mean to do it, they just ended up straying away. Another one might be that other sheep are doing it too. That they are flocking animals. Maybe you've seen videos, I think there was one from the BBC, I think it was maybe released in 2005, so I think it was a little older, but where sheep literally follow each other off a cliff. Sheep will just go where other sheep go. And so I think, as I read those, I was like, I think we stray for exactly these same reasons. We stray because we sense danger approaching. Rather than just trusting in God, we stray because we sense something bad is going to happen. I was reading online from Inc. magazine. There was a 2019 article from a psychotherapist and best-selling author named Amy Morin, and she wrote about the top 10 fears that hold people back in life. I don't know fully how scientific it is, but I think it comes from one of her best-selling works, so take that for what you will. But I thought these were relevant, at least for me, and resonated with something within me that is a little bit scared. Fears like the fear of change. We're afraid of change, so we keep doing the same old, because we're afraid of what might happen if we do something different. The fear of loneliness manifests in a number of different ways. This might not even manifest in you being isolated, but might actually manifest itself in you not taking off your mask to let people know you. And so you're surrounded by people, as many would say, that we're in the most connected time of the world, but actually more disconnected than ever. That you can actually be surrounded by people and incredibly lonely. And because we're afraid of being lonely, sometimes we put on a mask, or we just don't engage in that depth of relationship because we're afraid of what might happen, or because we've experienced hurt and we felt really alone. Others of us, myself included in all of, at least in the loneliness one so far, have a fear of failure. That we are afraid of messing up. That we don't see failure as an opportunity for growth and for learning, but actually if we fail, the message is not just I failed, it's I am a failure. That's one I can struggle with. My mom's here. She could tell you stories of me as a kid when I got a bad grade on a test that was like a 90 or something. I did not do well emotionally, which tells you something about a fear of mine. Others of us have the fear of rejection, that we are afraid to put ourselves out there for who we truly are because we're afraid of what might happen if someone was actually to know us. Others of us are afraid of uncertainty. Some of us like change and kind of uncertainty, and there's something exciting about that, although sometimes I think we like being certain that it is uncertain, if that makes sense. Might sound weird for those of you that really are more afraid of uncertainty, but we're afraid of that. Some of us are afraid of something bad happening, which really, if any of you let your mind roll long enough, you would be afraid of something bad happening if you thought about it hard enough, and hopefully I didn't just make you do that right now. Others of us are afraid of getting hurt. We're afraid of what might happen if we put ourselves out there, if we let someone truly know us, if we take a step in our faith or in career or whatever. We're afraid of what might happen to us. Others of us are afraid of being judged. Maybe we've even come to terms with who we are and where we're at, but we're afraid of what other people might think. Maybe because people have said some pretty harmful things to us in the past. Others of us are afraid of being inadequate, of not being enough, not being good enough. In whatever your thing is, in a relationship, that you never feel like you're good enough. In your job, you never feel like you're doing good enough. Imposter syndrome might be one version of this type of fear. Others of us are afraid of the loss of freedom. We're afraid of what might happen if we follow the Good Shepherd because that means that no longer am I the boss of my life. And so that's scary. Others of us, though, we might not stray necessarily because of these fears, although I'd argue these are pretty pertinent to all of us. Some of us stray just to satisfy our curiosity. Not necessarily because we're like terrified of something, but just something over here looks kind of interesting. And so I'm going to go and check it out this way. I can name multiple conversations I've had with people who've started getting into a particular sin pattern in their life that started primarily because of curiosity, and they just kind of followed it, and it led them astray. Others of us, we are led astray because we're just not paying attention while we're grazing, while we're doing life. We say it often here, but everything that we participate in is forming us and shaping us. It's discipling us, teaching us something, forming us into who we are becoming. There is a book that I've referenced often that, to be honest, I have not read the whole thing, but it was by a guy named Dr. Archibald Hart. And if you can just tell by his name, it seems like a trustworthy person, just based on the fact that his name is Archibald. And he has a doctor title before it. But he wrote this book called Thrilled to Death. And in this book, his premise was that we have become so stimulated and addicted to pleasure, like dopamine hits, that we have actually lost the ability to experience pleasure. And so he described this thing called anhedonia, which is literally means to the inability to experience pleasure, which used to be more predominantly associated with depression. And he made a very strong case that it's not just people who are depressed anymore, it's just the general population are unable to actually experience pleasure because we have, like neurochemically, just have so many the neurotransmitters going off our brain, we need more and more and more dopamine hits for everything. And so because we never are bored, we constantly go to our phones, we get a hit on a like or a comment or whatever, or even if you're not doing that, if you're playing a game, I mean, literally anything, we're constantly stimulated. And so we've lost the ability to experience pleasure. This is just one way that when we're not paying attention to what is forming us, these things that seem to be passive are actually doing something in your life. And they're forming you and shaping you. The other one is if other sheep are doing it too. I think I've heard it said somewhere that when a bunch of guys get in the same room together, that the collective IQ goes down. I've certainly experienced that to be true in my own life. Not just collective IQ, but the individual IQ, I think, also goes down. It's not always the best situation. Strong flocking instinct, like sheep. Peer pressure is a common example of this. And certainly there can be, if you're around good people, it can actually form you in a really wonderful way. But if you're around the wrong people, they can totally lead you astray. And so my question is, how are these things working out for you? How are these fears and being guided by these fears or just like idly walking through life, how is that working out for you? Because there is a different way that Jesus offers than being governed by those things. A way in which you can walk into change with something that is constant. The rock, the solid rock upon which we stand. No matter what around you is changing, we are able to hold fast to him. And as Jesus walked over the waters in different stories, symbolizing him standing over chaos and unknown and uncertainty, that we can trust in the one who is bigger than what is uncertain, that he is constant and he is good and he is faithful. If you struggle like me with feeling lonely, that in the midst of what could be isolating, knowing deep in the core of your being that you are deeply known. In verse 14 and 15 of chapter 10, Jesus says that he knows his own sheep and they know him just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. So I sacrifice my life for the sheep. That this knowledge isn't just a knowing about, it's an intimate knowing of a person. It's relational. I remember when I was a kid, I've like struggled with like social anxiety a lot of my life, and I was felt very lonely and isolated at a lot of times. And I remember one time I was like just feeling that particular, and I'm an emotional guy, so I don't remember how old I was, but if I remember right, I just started like crying, and I kind of sensed this invitation from God. It might sound really silly, but it was so beautiful to just tell God about my day. Like, and I remember getting up in my bunk bed and just, I think, crying and telling him, so today I ate this for lunch. And like, I did this in school, and I did this and this and this because I just was like, I need a friend. And we just sang a song like, I have known you as a father and I've known you as a friend. That's an invitation from the Good Shepherd to not only know about him, but to intimately know him and to recognize that he deeply knows you. Others of us are terrified of failure. And the invitation from Jesus is to realize that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I could not do enough to earn God's grace, but God being rich in mercy, those who confess their sins and believe in their heart that Jesus is Lord will be saved and able to have a relationship with him. And so, in other words, when I become a follower of Jesus, my primary identity now is a child of God, a saint. I'm no longer defined by my failure. I'm defined by his success on the cross. I'm defined by who he is and what he's done. And when I fail now, if it's a sin issue, I repent and I turn to God, see it as an opportunity for the healing of my soul, for me to become more of who God has made me to be. And on another senses, if it's like earthly success, for those of you in the room that are threes on the Enneagram or other ones of you that are really success-oriented like me, it's an invitation, even if in earthly senses you fail, if you're being faithful to the thing that God has for you, you are succeeding. It's an invitation to a deeper sense of identity. Others of us being afraid of rejection. First thing I would say is Jesus understands. In Isaiah 53, it says that he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. In John chapter 6, there's a story where disciples just desert him. That if you feel alone and deserted, he understands, and he feels that with you, but also that he will never leave you or forsake you. That's Hebrews 13:5. Psalm 94:4, for the Lord will not reject his people. He will never forsake his inheritance. Romans 8:1, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And in verse 31, what shall we say then to these things? If God is for us, who shall be against us? That those things are true about us in the pathway that Jesus invites us into. Even in John, it says that those that the Father has given me will come to me, and I will never reject them. In other words, if you follow Jesus, no matter how rejected you feel by everybody else, and even by yourself, because let's be honest, that's usually the one that you feel it from the most, God will never reject you. You are welcome. Psalm chapter 23 says that I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. All my days, I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. So we proclaim that to one another. Those that are afraid of uncertainty, that we can remind ourselves that God is faithful, that he who began a good work in us is faithful to complete it, that we trust in someone who sees. Though I'm uncertain, he certainly is not. If it's about something bad happening, one, we're kind of promised that that is going to happen. That's just inevitable for all of us. But we're told that we have God who is with us, Emmanuel, God who meets us in the midst of suffering, God who both sent his son to die on the cross, but also to be raised again. So we have a God who meets us in the midst of suffering and pain right now, but also that the bad thing won't get the last word. That God actually can take this bad thing that happened and turn it and actually use it into being something good in someone else and to form something within you to make you look more like Jesus. For those of us afraid of being hurt, that Christ's power is made perfect in our weakness, and that actually the things that are our hurts actually can become a help and a light and beacon of hope to others. For those of us that are afraid of being judged, we start off with the posture of I'm desperate for God. I'm a sinner in need of grace, but when I'm saved, when I come to faith in Jesus, my primary identity now is saint. And so when God looks at me, I'm judged through the lens of Christ's righteousness, not through my own. So no matter what anyone else thinks about me, I can rest in the fact of what he says about me because it's not dependent upon how I feel. It's not dependent upon what I did that day or what I ate or how much I slept or didn't sleep and how I'm feeling about myself or how I look in the mirror. It's not dependent upon any of those things. How I stand before God is righteous, because I am standing in the righteousness of Christ. For those of you that are afraid of inadequacy, God made you on purpose. Psalm 139 talks about him knitting you together in your mother's womb and knowing you before you were even born. He wasn't surprised when he made you. He knew your limitations as well as your giftedness. And if you actually are following Jesus, once again, you step into the adequacy of Christ. And we have the same Spirit of God who rose Jesus from the grave alive in us today. And those are words that we say and sound really trite, but think about it. Let that start to do a permeating work in your soul, that when you stand before God, if you follow Jesus, you are enough because you stand in Christ's enoughness. For those of us that are afraid of a loss of freedom, Scripture says it is for freedom, actually, that Christ has set us free. And ironically, the way that the Scriptures talk about things that we think will lead us to freedom are actually things that are enslaving us, entrapping us. James chapter 1 talks about that each person is lured by his own desires. And when desire, when it is fully conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. In other words, these desires, these things that you're wanting for freedom, actually can be the very things that entice you and entrap you. Maybe you found yourself in that way in your life before, that you did something one time or two times or three times because it sounded like it was a good idea then. But then it kept taking you on a path that you didn't want to go, and it became an addiction that was incredibly difficult to break. I'm reminded of, when I think of freedom, this imagery of playing guitar. Anybody else in here play guitar by chance? Okay, nice. So if you've ever played an instrument, you know that there's theory around the instrument. You can't just play whatever you want. Is that fair? If you just play whatever you want, it's going to sound really, really, really bad. Freedom is not about being able to do whatever you want. It's about being who you are made to be. And like a guitar, if I go and I pick it up and I've never played it before, I'm going to sound really bad. I might not even be able to get a note out because it's kind of hard to hold your fingers down on the frets. But if I learn about the guitar, learn how to play it, learn the scales, learn all that type of stuff, I'm able to have freedom in order to operate into the way that God has designed this. And same is true for you. The things that you think might lead to freedom are actually leading you to be less than human or less than who you are created to be. That God actually has a purpose for you. And much like if you're trying to learn from a sage or guitar instructor, if you're new to it, which, I mean, if it's God versus us, we're the sheep, he's the shepherd, we're called to trust what he says and go where he goes. And what I think is that not only this, but many of us are led by hired hands that don't have our best interests at heart. John 10 describes these hired hands as those who run when they see a wolf coming. There's parallels to this in Ezekiel 34. If you want to look later, Jeremiah 23, 1 through 3, and Zechariah 11, 15 through 17. The common denominator with these hired hands is that their primary concern is their own well-being at the expense of the flock's well-being. They abandon the flock and leave them to the wolves. And I am convinced that many of us have been so hurt by hired hands that it makes it incredibly difficult for us to believe that there is a good shepherd and that that shepherd is truly good. There's plenty of theory in psychology and otherwise to back up this kind of claim that our primary relationships in life actually become kind of the primary way in which we view God. And because a lot of us have been hurt by hired hands, whether in your life that's a parent or family member or a pastor or a boss or a romantic partner or a friend or whatever, that greatly impacts the way that you view God. And Jesus here tells us that he is the true shepherd, the one that we look to. He's both the gate, the way to life, and the shepherd who leads the way to life. And all of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. That's Isaiah 53, verse 6. So